All right, here we are. Welcome to the Hoopball YouTube channel, Media Day 1 reactions, guys. I am Alan Strokey, back at you with another video here. Very excited to be joined by my good friend, first time on the channel, but won't be the last, Mr. David Bracy. David, man, how are you doing? How are we feeling about what we have heard today?
Oh, Alan. Well, first of all, it's an absolute pleasure to finally make my debut on the show. We're feeling good. There's a lot of chatter. NBA Media Day is officially active, and boy, is there a lot to talk about. So I'm excited to get into it.
There is a ton to talk about. David is going to be more of a fixture on this channel going forward. He's going to be hosting shows here and there, along with some other people we'll be bringing in, of course. But, David and I, we've a long time been working together. We did a couple pods back in the day for the box score breakdown. And, of course, our good friend Brad Harden on the Hoopball Hawks show. You and I have done
Yes,
some
sir.
yeah, which I believe you guys got an episode coming up pretty soon. So y'all keep an eye out for that. But yeah, no, today, Media Day, a lot of interesting stuff that's come out. A lot of it fantasy relevant, a lot of it not. It's always the case on days like this. So David and I are going to help you break down the relevant from the irrelevant and sort of help y'all figure out the best course of action as we got 3 weeks until the NBA season starts. NBA preseason starts next week. So, I mean, we've got a lot to hit on today. And David, there's so many, there are a ton of different stories that we could touch on first. But I think the biggest one, at least in terms of its relevance to fantasy basketball, I guess there's a debate on which is the biggest, but I want to talk about this first because I was really shocked when I heard it. One of the first things of news that came in this morning was David Griffin giving a press conference, kicking things off for the New Orleans Pelicans in revealing that Zion Williamson fractured his foot 2 months ago, like completely under the radar. Something that really doesn't happen all that much in today's NBA, where transparency is such a big fixture on things. The situation as is that Zion had surgery on a fractured right foot. The team said that he should. I'm going to put quotations on that. Should be ready for the start of the NBA season, but there's no real indication. I mean, we were kind of blindsided by it. What were your first thoughts when you heard that news that this happened to Zion? And I mean, what do you make of this going forward?
It was very surprising. Of course, I mean, I kind of took everybody by surprise. We hadn't heard a whole lot. We had heard the legend of the piano man David Griffin, and some of the rumors about him courting Zion.
Yeah.
Trying to soothe the beast with some music. But all of that aside, this is definitely, I don't want to say cause for concern, because according to all the reports thus far, he will be available for the first game. We've heard he would be available, and then that was delayed previously. So hopefully, history doesn't repeat itself there. But in regards to history potentially repeating itself, this is a guy who has now had several injuries in his career. This is a guy who is a absolute behemoth of a physical specimen. This is a guy who is very explosive, and to see that he's fractured his foot, and in the interview, when they kind of asked him how did this happen, he said he was going through training and he kind of felt like he had a chip on his shoulder. He kind of had something that he wanted to prove. In the course of that training, he succumbed to this injury. Well, what is he going to come out of the gates with over the season? A lot of vitriol. He's going to have a lot to prove. He said it himself. He feels like he lost 2 seasons already, not making the playoffs, So Zion's going to come out of the gate firing, and hopefully his body holds up, because if it does, I mean, this guy is much more than a Hall of Fame level talent. This is the kind of this is the kind of talent that could really change the course of power in the NBA should he stay where he's at. So a lot to take from this.
And look, for me, I mean, I have a tiny rant about this just because, in today's league, transparency is kind of part of the gig. I mean, a lot of teams, most teams just do it. I'm pretty sure there are league policies about reporting injuries. And it was just shocking to me that you have such a significant injury to such a significant player go completely unreported until days before basketball activities stop. I mean, David Griffin just walked up, dropped a bomb on everyone, and act like nothing happened. I mean, man, to me, when I think about why they didn't report this when this happened, I believe they had quotes out there saying that this happened around Summer League. It just feels shady. It feels, because around that time, a lot of teams, what they do? reaching out to their season ticket holders, and they're renewing subscriptions. They're renewing those tickets. And it just feels like with a team that's been so demoralized with just like no playoff success, despite the incredible talent that they've amassed on that roster, all this, concerning stuff about Zion's feeling about the franchise, to avoid talking about this injury at the time. I feel like they were doing that with business in mind. It feels like they were trying to protect those season ticket sales, prevent fans from walking away because, there's nothing to see there if Zion's not going to be playing to start the year. And frankly, it doesn't seem like there's a chance he might not be ready to be out there for the start of the regular season. Or if you take what Willie Green said and sort of parse through, head coach Willie Green, you parse through what he was saying, that they're going to try and find some adjustments without him on the floor. It's what you want to do, but it sounds like there's a chance he's not going to play, man. And that to me is just once again another of a long series of things that David Griffin and company have done with this franchise. That just, if I were a Pelicans fan, I'd be pretty irked by it. This just, you owe it to your fan base to be selling them something to show that transparency. It just doesn't square with me. And obviously, from a fantasy basketball perspective, us in the fantasy basketball community, sure, there's plenty of people who are upset by that, because now that's tough to draft Zion if he's going to be injured to start the year. You want to avoid players like that. And that would be my advice to take away from this news. Look, Zion, he's already going really high in drafts, in the mid-20s. That's still pretty high considering the numbers that he's put up in the past. Now with this injury news combined, you just can't afford to take him there at all. So pretty shocking stuff out of New Orleans. I was not anticipating that. And it is something that's definitely going to be something worth monitoring going forward on his status. What else? Do you have any other thoughts on that situation? Am I being a little too conspiratorial with the whole thing? Because that's what it seems like. Why would they hide it until now?
Yeah, well, not too conspiratorial. Unfortunately, we live in a very conspiratorial age, but that's another combo for another podcast. My apologies for the sirens that you heard during your conversation there, but it kind of seemed appropriate for a franchise that is perpetually in crisis mode, and that is the New Orleans Pelicans. I'm sorry for all the fans listening to the show right now. But yeah, in regards to them, kind of being shifty, at a minimum here with the Zion injury news, this is just one of many, NBA franchises that has done their best to keep the player health of their superstar, kind of an in-house secret. You look at how Kawhi Leonard has continued to be managed and treated, with him kind of giving more clarity on his status today in his presser, more than he has, thus far in his career. So that's a continuously evolving situation, as is the NBA's kind of partnership with a lot of these betting, these betting industries. So it's kind of hard to really, invest your money into betting and wagering, as well as, drafting players when you don't necessarily know what a player's status is. So it's something to continually monitor, because the NBA is really going to have to do something if they want to continue this going forward in the right way.
It will be interesting to see if there is any sort of ramification for that from the league's side of things. But yeah, just again to recap, Zion Williamson, fractured right foot. Adjust your draft boards accordingly. The man was already going pretty high in most category leagues. Points leagues, sure, that's fine. But this dude is, for a guy as explosive as him, a foot injury coming into the season he might not even be ready for. You got to bump him down a round or two if you're drafting him this season. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the major, before we dive more into some of these fantasy angles, let's talk about some of this NBA news that came out today. It's just more NBA focused. We'll start with the Brooklyn Nets. They also had media days today. Interesting comments from Kevin Durant and James Harden. And then obviously there's a lot of attention about Kyrie Irving right now. In particular, the Brooklyn Nets are one of 3 teams in the NBA that will require any player, not only all staff, all attendees in the venue, they require all players to show vaccination status in order to play. There's obviously fantasy basketball ramifications with that. Kyrie, for his part, we know, he's choosing to keep that a personal matter. People are speculating that he might not be able to play in Brooklyn Nets games, which is obviously going to be a big deal in terms of their ability to contend for a title. So, I mean, how do you see this playing out, David? And it's kind of an unfair question and something that we don't have to dwell too long on because so much of it will rely on speculation. But do you imagine that Kyrie and the Nets are going to figure out a way to get him out there for Brooklyn Nets home games going forward?
That's a great question. And listening to Kyrie's comments today in the media appearance that he had on Zoom, because, obviously he wasn't allowed to actually be in the facility. He really just pressed the media, if you will, ironically, about allowing him and affording him the privilege of his privacy in regards to anything that even kind of waded into the waters of vaccination status. He was very closed off in regards to, questions about his availability for home games. He did say that he was very excited, to continue this journey day by day. He looks forward to being able to perform in front of the fans. But outside of that, he was very closed off in what he was going to give the media as far as his vaccination status and plans in that regard going forward. Kevin Durant made comments saying that he expected Kyrie to be available. So in that regard, you would hope that both KD and James also have a little bit more insight into that situation than obviously, the media and the rest of the team perhaps would. Maybe Steve Nash, maybe Sean Marks has some insight there. But yeah, this is going to be an issue. Unfortunately, for the entirety of the season, we see it already being an issue on several other teams. Andrew Wiggins is looking at forfeiting almost $9 million in about 40-some home games if he chooses not to get vaccinated per Golden State. So there's real-world ramifications on both ends of this financially and otherwise. People absolutely are afforded their right to, their beliefs. But ultimately, as many of us have had to come to the realization of, when we return to work, we have to return to work in the way that our employer dictates. And so we will see how this goes.
Yeah. And I mean, look, this is the type of situation that it's either the Nets and Kyrie find a workaround around these rules, or he ultimately gets vaccinated, because, this is a team with championship aspirations. And I don't really see a world where your third best player isn't there for playoff home games, right? There's got to be some sort of impact. Something's going to have to give in that situation, and we'll find out more in the lead up to the season. As far as fantasy is concerned, though, and this is just an objective fact, goes without saying, any of these players that are playing in Brooklyn, New York, or Golden State, like Wiggins or Kyrie, who are at odds on this vaccination status, you can't draft them at all in any format. You can't have players that you can just write off half of their games immediately, not even factoring in the risk of injury, other situations that could hold them out. That's just something that you can't afford, no matter how talented Kyrie is. Another thing I found interesting from the Nets conferences today was James Harden talking about his health, saying that he's fully past the hamstring injury from last year. But also, the thing that I found to be more interesting was how he sort of took accountability for the mindset that he had last year and the being physically prepared for the NBA season. I think a lot of that's in reference to the way he left Houston, there much has been made about the conditioning the state of his conditioning that he was in at the time, that he was intentionally not in game shape. Some speculated that even led to the injury this season. He's a very durable guy throughout the course of his career. Do you feel encouraged by that from Harden? Do you feel that this taking accountability for that shows? There's a video of him shooting in the gym, and I'll tell you that he looked cut up to me. That looks like he's definitely not in Houston James Harden shape. How do you feel? Do you feel that he's in for a bigger season in Brooklyn, both in real life and in fantasy?
Well, I just want to start off by saying, in James Harden's defense, round is a shape. So technically he was in shape. Bat suit or not, we definitely saw James Harden that looked like he was more ready for the couch than the court while he was in Houston, and shortly there left. But definitely, I think, that takes a toll on your body. We see how these athletes and these actors are, often just able to undertake these incredible physical transformations due to the training processes that go into their everyday lives. So I'm sure, that had a toll on him. There was a lot of adjustments to be made last season outside of, COVID, outside of switching teams, outside of, just the everyday training that he had to go through with two different front offices. So absolutely, I look forward to James Harden's performance this season. I think he, more so than both of the other superstars on the team, specifically Kyrie and Kevin Durant, has the most to prove. since he's the only guy without a championship. So there's a lot for James Harden to gain from this season. Personally, I feel much more confident as a fan of the Nets if he, had signed an extension. But that remains to be seen here since he is eligible for one. Earlier today in his comments in that regard, he kind of said, he wants to do what's best not only for himself, but for the team specifically. And he's been a guy who's been able to have a lot of individual success. And now he's looking to really achieve that ultimate goal, which is to win a championship. So hopefully, his words bear out here. We know what kind of player James Harden is when he's available and when he's on the court. He's absolutely phenomenal. He's otherworldly, and he's an MVP candidate. So if he shows up as all those things for the Brooklyn Nets this year on top of everything else, it's going to look pretty good for him.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm feeling pretty confident about his ability to bounce back this year because, like I said, James Harden is one of the most durable players in the NBA before what happened to him last year. And that's hamstring injuries can linger. They can be really tricky in terms of how long they take to heal. And there was obviously pressure to get Harden back onto the floor. He re-aggravated that injury both in this regular season and then again in the playoffs. So I think that he's taken a little bit of a stock hit because of that. I mean, he was also very when he got to Brooklyn, he was very deferral to KD and Kyrie. We saw him be a lot more of a facilitator. Roping it all back to fantasy basketball this year, he's the Brooklyn net that I'm most comfortable drafting, I'd say, in that first round, because I do think that he will ultimately be the most reliable in terms of how many games he can get out there for. And I think that we'll see him take a little more of an aggressive approach to scoring the basketball more this season. I think the fact that he takes accountability and wants to be better, physically better and more available for this team is something that's encouraging. He's currently getting drafted within your first 5 picks. I think that's a range I'm comfortable taking in most leagues, category points otherwise. So I think that was a noteworthy comment today. I mean, again, in so many of these media day sessions, there's a difference between what you hear and then what plays out. But that is something that I think is at least encouraging. I'll kick it to you, David. Is there any? We'll just bounce around the rest of the NBA now. Is there any sort of comments that you saw today that you thought caught your eye and is something that might be very relevant to the upcoming NBA season?
Well, in that regard, I guess I would be remiss if we didn't do our part to contribute to the Ben Simmons discord here. So let's just talk about it briefly.
Just touch on it.
Well, we
have no choice. I mean, until something happens, we got to touch on it.
Absolutely. I mean, there's only so much to talk about other than Ben Simmons and his lack of a jump shot. But anyways.
And a very original conversation, too, at that.
Absolutely. Doc and Daryl Morey, they addressed the media. The media had a lot of questions. Doc was not very happy about the media's recollection of his comments about Ben Simmons and whether or not he is a championship caliber point guard. Doc says that the reason he said no was because he wasn't answering that question and he was actually not thinking about the question. He was trying to deflect from the question. Sure. I'm sure all of us have had a conversation like that at some point in our lives with somebody who knows that we are lying, but they still love us and we love them. So that's what that was. Doc loves Ben. Ben, I don't know how he feels about Doc, but he told Doc and the rest of the Sixers, don't come to my address because I'm not going to open the door. He has a ring cam. He could see where they were coming from. Didn't want that package. So the whole Ben Simmons situation, as far as Daryl and Doc has described it, is a situation that they, quote unquote, wish were, able to be fixed, that they, quote unquote, want Ben back as a 76er. Again, this is coming from a guy who Doc made the comments we just talked about, and Daryl tried to trade Ben Simmons essentially from the moment he got there. I mean, that's far from a secret. They were, a couple hours to midnight on the Ben Simmons to the Houston Rockets trade, and then, Brooklyn came in. So I think that relationship, unfortunately, is absolutely done. As far as Ben's relationship with Daryl and Doc, now Ben's relationship with the rest of the team, I mean, that's something that remains to be seen. And I'm sure you probably saw some of Embiid's, comments today. He was, doing his best really to clean up the situation, imparting the fact that he thinks that Ben is a very valuable asset to this team, that it's not his team. It's always been, the team, and that Ben is a big part of, quote unquote, the team, that, quote unquote, the team has to take responsibility and share responsibility for their lack of playoff success, not only last postseason, but in all the postseasons that they've shared together. And again, it's a situation where maybe it's a little, too little, too late. But in the modern age of player empowerment and Ben Simmons having the backing of Rich Paul and Clutch Sports, when he says he's out, he's probably out. So remains to be seen what the Sixers, really do from here. And in that regard, my question to you, Alan, would be looking at the Sixers and looking like the Ben Simmons situation is kind of untenable. Where do you anticipate his fantasy value being, independent of knowing what team he's on? And then if there is no Ben Simmons, let's say superstar X comes in, or, trade pieces to be used in the future come in, who is that Sixer that you think takes the biggest jump in the absence of Ben Simmons?
Yeah, that's a tough one because, it's a question that we've been asking, for the whole duration of this situation. And to me, determining what his fantasy value, Ben Simmons is, that is, what it will be and wherever the next stop is just, until we know a destination, it's really hard to say. There are some situations that he could fall into where he is focused almost exclusively on being a distributor and being a defender. There could be a situation where he's the man and he ends up being a primary option on offense. And that has a wide range of possibilities for fantasy value. But as far as the guys that are going to, the reality here is that this trade's probably not happening before the season starts. Maybe it does, but assuming it doesn't, Tyrese Maxey appears to be the guy to take over that starting gig in Philadelphia. In particular, I know not only were Doc and Morey, I think they talked him up today. Teammates were also talking about how Maxey's got some star potential. I believe Danny Green said something to that effect. A lot of fans of Maxey in that locker room, and frankly, I'm a big fan of him too. I think that he will be a really solid NBA player. I think that it seems that he'll be that starting point guard for them if they just go into the season with the same roster that they have. Maybe we see more Matisse Thybulle, since you take away Simmons' lack of jump shot from the equation. Now you can put now you can put Matisse in his lack of jump shot, but also similarly really high upside defensive capabilities. Maybe you see more of him. But that's really kind of it in terms I'd say the other big takeaway is that we're probably going to see an incredibly inspired Joel Embiid this season. It remains to be seen, as it always is, how many games he ultimately ends up playing. But I have a feeling that this could be a repeat of the year we saw on a per game basis from him last year, where he was runner up in the MVP conversation. But maybe even to a larger degree. I think that there's still levels that he can go up to carry this team. I liked a lot of what he said today. I thought it was pretty fair and introspective. He didn't back down from the things that he said in the press conference following their loss to Atlanta in the Eastern semis. That's just going to be, that's just my read on it for right now. We'll see where things go from there. But a lot of dancing around the subject from Morey, which I thought was pretty funny, saying that, they're still big on Simmons and they do expect him to report at some point. Yeah, we'll see about that. But that's those are some of the bigger takeaways, of course, from a lot of the real life NBA stuff that we heard in these media day sessions. But I do think there's a lot of fantasy stuff to take away too, shifting through some of the noise. There are some interesting tidbits, and I want to start with Chicago. They had their media session about midday, and they, in particular, just got some interesting comments from Billy Donovan about how he, obviously this is a team that had a complete overhaul with their roster. And we some of the interesting things that we saw was that Lonzo Ball anticipates to be playing in more of a traditional point guard role. In particular, he made a distinction from the way that he played in New Orleans, where he was playing a lot of two guard for that team. And they according to him and Donovan, the ball is going to be more in his hands this season. He's going to be more of a distributor. Another thing is that DeMar DeRozan, they talked about him playing some power forward minutes this year, which is something that he did in San Antonio. But certainly an interesting comment considering the wing depth that they have on that team to maybe squeeze them into certain lineup configurations. Why don't we talk a little bit about your read on how you anticipate the Chicago Bulls season to go? How do you think these pieces are all going to connect to each other, and what does that mean for some of their fantasy values like Ball and DeRozan?
Well, as an Illinois homer, I definitely am hoping, the Bulls are able to really, pull this season together and turn it into something special.
Yeah.
They are one of the teams, in my opinion, that has one of the highest levels of variance possible for their season outcome.
Yeah.
You look at Vucevic, you look at DeRozan, you look at Ball, you look at Levine. This could be a very, very supercharged offense. My main concern for them has always been what are they going to do defensively. So the loss of Patrick Williams potentially to open the season, that definitely, is unfortunate. Hopefully he's not out for anything, too long, and he's able to come back and contribute to their season in a major way. I think it's going to be big time for Alex Caruso, definitely not only from a real life perspective, but from the fantasy angle. He's going to get a lot of the shine there, according to some of the comments there. And DeRozan, shifting to the power forward, again, this is just going to help supercharge that offense. You got DeRozan and Vooch working the low block, potentially DeRozan slashing. Vooch is one of the best big men passers in the league. I mean, it has been. This is also a guy who can step out and hit the three, so you don't really have to worry about spacing in that regard. Fortunately for them, their least proficient shooter would happen to be their point guard and also one of their better defensive players, one of their best playmakers. So the things that Lonzo may lack, he's going to be surrounded by, fortunately, in Chicago. And I think that's where you see that more traditional point guard role, that comment kind of come into play there, because his job really will be to, facilitate that offense, to take some of the playmaking ease off of Zach LaVine, get him open shots, to find Vooch rolling to the rim, to help DeRozan, because again, this is a guy, both him and Vucevic, who are older, that they're not going to be able to do it night in and night out like they used to. And LaVine is a guy who is looking to, potentially get a big contract this offseason. So you can expect him to want to come out and have big numbers. He's going to want to get a lot of that run. He is Chicago's unquestioned superstar, regardless of their postseason moves. And the franchise really lies in his hands. His ceiling will dictate just how far the Chicago Bulls can go.
It's really interesting stuff. And I was surprised to hear the emphasis on Lonzo being a traditional point guard, because I thought that one of the strengths of what Chicago did was that they added playmakers at every position outside Patrick Williams. Like, Vooch is a good passer. DeRozan is a good passer. He's a good connector in that offensive scheme. And LaVine is odd, like you mentioned. They want to take some of those the brunt of the playmaking responsibilities off of him. And I think turning to Lonzo is a way to do that. But I was curious whether or not it'd be more of a committee, or facilitating by committee, or they would try and run a more traditional offense through someone like Lonzo. So that's something to monitor, certainly, in terms of how it impacts rotations, and what that looks like statistically, just going forward in the season. But whatever way you cut it, that to me sounds like a pretty positive for Lonzo's fantasy value, especially because I think that he's really the only traditional point guard on that roster. I wouldn't consider Kobe White to be.
I agree.
Yeah, right. Like, so that seems like there's going to be a large emphasis on Lonzo playing a lot of minutes too, if that's the way that they kind of want to run things up there. But quick question here from Luke. And by the way, if y'all are listening, you want to drop comments about stuff that we heard in media days today, just general fantasy stuff, by all means, drop them in. Here's something, though, from Luke, and he's interested in the league-wide policy on unvaccinated players, like the Wiggins situation, or is it state by state? And to reemphasize on this point, this is a state issue. This is really like this is municipality. This is city by city. For Wiggins' situation, the city of San Francisco has made the rule that anyone who attends an indoor event has to have proof of vaccination. A lot of stadiums around the country will either ask for the proof of vaccination or proof of a negative test. That latter bit is how a lot of these other teams are going to be able to get around some of these players who may or may not be vaccinated. But the reason that the Wiggins story and the Kyrie story are that much louder than the others is because they live in cities that are stricter about that kind of stuff. So, from what I read about Wiggins too, I mean, it's going to be a non-starter. I mean, in a lot of these situations, I mean, that's just going to be the way it has to go, though. And again, the only teams that have the strictest version of this vaccine policy, or will have to abide by it, are the Warriors, the Knicks, and the Nets. And to my knowledge, I believe that the Knicks have said that every player on their roster is fully vaccinated. So they're kind of out of that equation. It really does seem to be Kyrie and Wiggins who are in this particular bind, by not being able to play home games potentially. So thanks for that question, Luke. We appreciate that. Here's another interesting thing I read about today. The Houston Rockets, I think, are a fascinating team. I'm going to love watching them. They're not going to win a whole lot of games, but they got Kevin Porter Jr. as their starting point guard. And that man came out today and said it. He said, I'm the starting point guard, and I'm going to average 10 assists this year. Love the boldness, and I think that a lot of people are excited about him in fantasy this year. But it was important to note that Coach Steven Silas came out and said that the rotations are not set. He does not know. He says that KPJ and Jalen Green are going to play next to each other, but he didn't say that they're going to start necessarily. Do you feel that that's just sort of smokescreen stuff? Do you imagine Jalen Green and Kevin Porter Jr. being that starting backcourt for them this year, or do you think or would you believe there's another player that could possibly step in there?
Truthfully, I don't see how it could be anybody else. If the Houston Rockets were to start, the only other option, which would be a backcourt of John Wall and Eric Gordon, I think there would be a lot of concern, much more concern than if they started the latter, or the former, I should say. So, yeah, I would expect Porter Jr. and Green to both start. Fortunately for Kevin Porter and his 10 assists per game hopes, Jalen Green is an absolute bucket. So that should be something that can be accomplished. Not to mention you also have Christian Wood. You have the addition of, and I'm spacing on his name. I believe he's the Turkish guy. They have a lot of potential, especially offensively, to be very, very supercharged. And they're young. They don't have anything really to lose. So they have a young coach. They have a bunch of young, cornerstones. And really, it's all about getting them developed, getting them as much run and opportunity as possible. So I expect big things for the Houston Rockets from an individual player perspective and a fantasy angle specifically. If you're looking for guys who are going to really help carry your team potentially in later rounds, I would target guys like a Kevin Porter Jr. I would target guys, like a Christian Wood, like a Jalen Green. I would not reach for these guys necessarily, especially Christian Wood, given his sordid injury history. But like I said, we see this time and time again on these franchises that are, the league pass all-stars. They have a lot of guys who really, really can help, power your fantasy team, especially during, the middle season malaise, as I like to call it, where a lot of these guys start to get load managed. A lot of your first round draft picks succumb to some type of injury where they're out X amount of days. When you have a guy like that, especially on a week where they have a bunch of games against other teams like that, they can go absolutely crazy. So definitely like what I'm seeing from Houston as far as the comments coming out of there. I like their guys. They've got energy. They've got attitude. And it's going to be a team that I'm definitely looking forward to tuning in and watching.
Speaking of load managing, there was an interesting little I was going to make a terrible pun unintentionally, and I stopped myself. I was going to say an interesting nugget that came out of Denver. I dislike myself for even thinking that unintentionally, subconsciously there. But then Mike Malone, talking to the Denver press, was reaffirming that they plan to load manage Nikola Jokic at certain points this year, reigning MVP. And obviously, that is load management has become well known throughout fantasy circles. Jokic is was one of the players who famously played every single game last year, maybe save for one, maybe. My question to you, David, is there any NBA player that won't be load managed at this point? Like legitimately, can you think who is the player that you could think of that is probably primed to play 82 games this year if they exist?
Kevin Porter Jr. No, I'm just kidding. No, honestly, when you're talking about the marquee guys, to your point, it's just become, so commonplace. And again, that's a big part of the NBA and this transparency problem when it comes to player health. This is the caveat, you can bet on the game and you can, hope and wish, but, up until that guy's locked in, he could be absolutely pulled out of that lineup, for quote unquote load management, and really nobody bats an eye. So this is something that you're going to have to always expect, especially when you're drafting, the cream of the crop at the beginning of the draft. All those guys are going to, miss games. I would say everybody that you're going to draft probably within the top 15, probably even 20 draft picks, depending on where everybody falls. All those guys are going to miss, games for load management. That is going to happen as teams slug through the regular season and try to make it to the playoffs. guys are going to sit. They're going to want to preserve their guarantee, their ticket, if you will, into the playoffs, because really nobody wants to end up in the play-in. For as much fun as it is to watch for a franchise, I can only imagine that it is an absolutely terrifying proposition. So you really want to do everything you can to keep yourself out of that. And you can expect a lot of the teams at the top of both conferences to, rest guys going forward.
Yeah, I mean, we're at the point where, in fantasy drafts, you're always trying to target the guys based off of durability. You want to avoid situations like this, but I mean, it is so pervasive throughout the NBA that there's just not. It's. I'm not saying that you just ignore durability and games played, because you obviously can't do that. But guys who miss games is just commonplace now. And if Nikola Jokic is going to start walking down that path, whether he likes it or not, because I don't think that he's really bought into that notion, even though he said he'll listen to the Nuggets doctors and their opinions on that. But it's just going to be a factor for pretty much all these guys that you're drafting. The stars are going to get load managed. The veterans are going to get load managed. The Oklahoma City Thunder will find a way to load manage their 21-year-old players like they did last year. I'm still not over that. And I'm going to be mad again when they do it this year. So that
cost me a championship, unfortunately. Yeah, hurts.
Right. I mean, unbelievable stuff in that one. And by the way, Luke, another comment here, and he reminded me some breaking news that came out before we got on here. But Michael Porter Jr. Signed the max contract, the rookie extension. And he wants to know whether or not there are any details on injury/games played for Michael Porter Jr. given the max. And I think that is a no. And I like that, because frankly, I don't think Denver does this if they don't feel good about his health long term, right? At least not to the degree to which they paid him. Michael Porter Jr. got the same deal that Luka Doncic, Trae Young, and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander got. They got the most possible amount of money. So in my mind, this is a positive sort of like seal of approval from the Denver staff on how they feel about Porter's long-term health. This is one of the most gifted young scorers in the NBA. He is someone who can, he doesn't require flexibility to get his shot off. He just has the size and the silky touch from anywhere on the floor. So I think that you have to view that as a positive. I mean, generally, re-signing young guys who are talented to as much money as you can, that's not exactly like, there's not a whole lot of analysis there. But in Porter Jr.'s case, I think there is something positive to take out of that in their long-term prognosis. What do you make of that deal? Do you think that that's a fair deal for Denver long-term?
Well, definitely, Luke, with the great questions. This was a front office that definitely had a lot to prove. They needed to step up and, actually, they've said in the past, we're willing to pay, we're willing to spend, we're willing to, go into luxury tax, et cetera, et cetera. Have not done that as of yet, done everything they could at the deadline to always get out of that. This is them potentially saying we're willing to do that. We feel that Jokic, Jamal Murray, when he's healthy and is back in the lineup, and Michael Porter Jr. are going to be our key pieces going forward. We feel like this is a superstar tandem, that this is a championship caliber roster, and we will continue to build around it. You saw them give a contract to Aaron Gordon. It only is fitting that they give Michael Porter Jr. his contract. I believe it's 5 years, $170+ million. Again, I'm sure as we get more clarity on this deal and all the specifics, there will be a lot of, injury provisions, clauses, et cetera, in there, because this is a guy who had, quote unquote, the worst medical report, that they had ever seen. So take that again for what you will. Especially in an age that is dominated by media voices and not necessarily by players. And that continues to evolve and change, so that's something to monitor as well. But Michael Porter has yet to make any comments on this situation. I'm sure he'll be on Twitter and post several money bag emojis or something to that nature, letting everybody know that he's happy about it. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is a guy who 100%, it comes with the territory. And this is a guy who seems happy and confident in Denver. This is a guy who believes in himself. He's a very, very unique, physical specimen as far as, his abilities on and off the court. And it remains to be seen what the training and the health management kind of situation in Denver is going to do to add to the longevity of his career. There have been rumors and murmurs online about potentially him being traded for Ben Simmons. I don't necessarily know if that's the case.
That one.
I don't know either. I know 172 is not 197, so those salaries don't necessarily match, but it is definitely interesting. But yeah, I think Denver really is committed to Michael Porter Jr. and they're hoping for the best with him, and he's definitely hoping to have a lot of run this season because, to your point, Alan, if Jokic is going to be load managed, obviously Jamal Murray is going to be out for an extended period of time. They're going to rely heavily on Michael Porter Jr. and his offensive abilities as well as his defensive abilities to really help carry that team during the regular season. And if we're being honest here, as great as Jamal Murray is, Michael Porter Jr. absolutely has to be the Nuggets' second best player if they hope to be a championship caliber team in the West, because it is an absolute murderer's row out there.
Yeah, man, I agree. I think that he has the highest upside of those two just based off of the intangibles, the position that he plays. It's in today's league, you can be really versatile with the different kinds of lineups you can roll out there with this guy who can score at all three levels and do it as efficiently as anyone. And I think he's in for a pretty big season. I'm pretty high on his prospects in fantasy drafts right now. His ADP is around the late 20s. And there's an opportunity. There's not a whole lot for him to grow beyond that valuation, but there is a world, and I'm not saying that it's likely, but there is a world where he could play himself. Michael Porter Jr. could play himself to be a first-round level player this year. I mean, he certainly did to close the season last year when Jamal Murray went down. Those 17 games or so, Michael Porter Jr., the scoring, rebounding, efficiency, blocking a shot per game, all of those numbers were getting him close to, if not within, that first round level in 9 category leagues. So I'm pretty high on him long term. I think he's going to have a big year as the clear cut number 2 in Denver this season. And the Nuggets giving him the contract they did is absolutely them saying that they fully agree. They are all in on Michael Porter Jr. He's definitively going to be a part of what they do going forward. So let's just go through a few more rapid fire things. I think some noteworthy reports that I saw today, and if you have any that you'd like to throw in there, David, by all means, let's go through those. Pascal Siakam out of Toronto. We'll start there. He's not cleared for contact workouts yet, so keep that in mind when you're drafting him. He's recovering from shoulder surgery. He figures to be able to play at the start of the season. I think his earliest return date would be the 1st of November, so keep tabs on that. But this report indicates that he's still a little bit away from getting to the level of practice that you would hope. Scotty Barnes, by the way, rookie drafted 4th overall. Nick Nurse heaped a lot of praise on the rookie and said that he's going to play big minutes early on. I think that's pretty interesting. We know that Nick Nurse loves to ride his rotations pretty strongly, so I don't think I'd draft Scotty Barnes in most standard leagues quite yet, but he's someone I'm definitely keeping an eye on. Out of Atlanta, Clint Capella is working his way back from some Achilles injury that he suffered. Well, really, he dealt with all of last season, which I found to be interesting because it was probably the best year of his career. But he figures to he's working his way back up into shape in camp. We will see how far away he is from playing. Kevin Love, this one I thought was pretty interesting. I mean, not the first part, not as much. He said that he never had any buyout talks with the Cavs. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's because they like brought it up, and his agent was like, "Yeah, we're not doing that." So technically, they did not talk about it. But he threw that out there and said that he has yet to talk to the head coach about his role this year. That's an interesting note. I don't anticipate that it's going to be a particularly large role for Kevin Love in Cleveland. Not sure where that one goes from here. And Isaiah Stewart, Kelly Olynyk, they're going to share the floor together as well. Dwayne Casey was very high on that pairing, which I think is very positive for both players' fantasy values going forward. Any other notes that you think that stood out to you today that you want to touch on, David, or any of the ones that I just talked about that you want to dive in a little bit more on?
No, honestly, just kind of rapid fire, just, kind of react to some of yours. The Siakam situation, it remains trivial. and confusing in Toronto. I'm not really sure where his role is currently on the team, and as far as his view and as far as the front office's view, don't know if those are aligned. One could honestly say that they're probably not, given the fact, to your second point, that they drafted Scotty Barnes and appear to, really be, eager to give him a lot of run and opportunity here. And Toronto loves to draft guys in his mold, like you said, Siakam, OG. They have a lot of these guys. So I'm excited to see what that looks like. I think he's got a lot of potential. A lot of scouts gushed about him, prior to the draft, and even more so after his summer league debut. So it's definitely a situation I'm going to continue to monitor. If he's available for me late in drafts, totally worth a flyer here. But yeah, by all means, to your point, Alan, definitely not somebody that you're prioritizing necessarily in your draft, unless some kind of crazy news comes out about Siakam, leading up to opening night, and then hey, his availability could change that situation. Clint Capella, I really hope that he's good to go for the season because he is a huge part of Atlanta's. He's a huge part of Atlanta's team, offensively and defensively. He really anchors them on both ends of the floor. I really love his game. I love his energy. I love his attitude. So yeah, I hope Capella can come back and have a fully healthy season this year because, like you said, he was kind of nursing a couple different injuries last year. And I'm sure me and Brad are going to discuss this a little bit more detail later on his Hoop Ball Hawks podcast. So definitely, as you mentioned at the top of the show, check that out if you haven't already. Absolutely. Shout out. And yeah, just, continuing to go through it. I'm trying to remember what was the last point that you covered, because I do have a point that I want to dive into, and I'm so eager to.
Kelly Olynyk and Isaiah Stewart sharing the floor.
That's what I thought you said. Yes. Yeah. And I apologize to all the Detroit Pistons fans out there. This is a franchise that is so in the back of my memory. It's hard to remember their moves. But they had, a pretty good offseason. Cade Cunningham is in town. Very excited about that. That is a guy who definitely will love having both Olynyk and Stewart on the floor because they're floor spacing big men. Stewart a little less than Olynyk. Stewart more with the roll into the rim, attacking the basket type of angle. But for Cade Cunningham, a guy who is very vertical himself, that's great. I mean, that's great. Look at Capella. You can absolutely make that work. Olynyk is a guy who continues to, find his niche kind of wherever he goes. And it's a guy who you'll never remember on draft day, but the first time somebody else picks him up off waivers, you're just so mad at yourself because it should have been you. It should have been you. And then the guy comes out and he beats you in that matchup because of Kelly Olynyk. So keep your eye on him. Definitely a guy who I think has all the opportunity in the world to play in Detroit. I mean, they're still playing Plumlee's. So
Plumlee's in charge. He's basically sliding into that backup center role. But I agree
now. Totally. But yes, but that's to your point. I mean, yeah. he has been overcome now, but before, I mean, this is a guy who had plenty of opportunity. And come on, I mean, how far away is Detroit from Duke? It's pretty far. So
I'm very high on both of them. like Isaiah Stewart, I need to pump the brakes on how much I hype him up because I want him to be available on draft day. But I see him as a very, very high upside big. Like you mentioned, he did work a little bit on his outside shot towards the end of last year, sort of went under the radar, but definitely an element of his game that he could add to the mix. I just like knowing that he and Olynyk, that Dwayne Casey's open to playing those two together. Of course, it's a wait and see type of situation, but Olynyk is someone I would even consider drafting this year, maybe outside your top 120 picks and then get a steal for someone who ends up being a top 100 player. Because he's definitely, that pick and pop ability is something that they're definitely wanting to mix with Cade Cunningham and Killian Hayes. Those two need to get those two up to speed at the NBA level as playmakers and distributors. Having a guy with his offensive skill set will be really helpful for that. So I anticipate that he'll play, plenty of minutes, and especially be splitting time with Stewart. That's an avenue to get above 24 minutes a game, which is really a sweet spot for his fantasy value and Stewart's, by the way. The more that those two can share the floor together, just the better, honestly. That is the best that is the best outlook there. Luke also dropped some about Luka Garza being pretty stringent competition there. I don't really know if he will be giving him those two any work for rotation minutes, at least early on. maybe when the Pistons are packing things in, maybe we see Luka Garza get out there. But we will see in that respect here. We have someone else from Brad Harden here, our good buddy Brad. He talking Precious Achiuwa. He is curious. I guess he's not curious. He's telling us that he thinks that he could have the same impact as Isaiah Stewart. I like Precious Achiuwa, and it is worth mentioning that he was acquired by Toronto in that Miami Heat deal over the summer.
Absolutely.
They're going to be starting Kim Birch at that center spot, but I don't think that that's necessarily locked down for good. Achiuwa is definitely someone who, you know how you throw a little star on the waiver wire, your watch list type of guys. He's certainly someone that I'm going to be keeping an eye on in that respect. And in particular, Pascal Siakam is not good to go for any portion of the season. That does create more opportunities for him to get out there. So we will definitely keep an eye on him as well. Any closing thoughts before we wrap things up here? Any thoughts on, Kristaps Porzingis had a pretty chipper press conference and talking about how, he's ready to help the team in whatever way. He also wants to make sure that he's utilized correctly. One of those, to me, I mean, I didn't hear it, so maybe I'm misrepresenting what he said. It sort of seemed like I'll help the team, but, as long as I get mine type of things. I mean, do you feel that Luka, Kristaps Porzingis relationship, you think that that's one that's going to lead to any real life success this year?
Well, for the Mavericks, it absolutely has to. It has to. This is kind of a breaking point for Dallas as a franchise here. They have a whole new regime in there that went overseas to court, the unicorn over the offseason, to reinforce the fact that he is an important part of this team, this franchise, the offense as well as the defense, and that they're going to need him, going forward. So that's why he's, back. That's why he's engaged and hopefully excited to play for this franchise. But it's very, very important. There's a lot of what ifs. What if Kristaps Porzingis has a healthy season? What if he looks active and engaged on both ends of the floor? What if Luka Doncic takes the next step? What if Jason Kidd, is a good coach? And to me, that is the biggest what if. I'm going to be and that's the question, because we saw the absolute disaster that happened in Milwaukee, and I don't think it's a coincidence that the year after he leaves, they win 60+ games. So I have to give Jason Kidd his respect and his credit, as an incredible NBA talent, as a guy who just won a championship with the Los Angeles Lakers as a member of their coaching staff. Yeah. So no shade in that regard, but there's a lot of question marks for Dallas, and Luka signed that contract, so he's bought in. But the question is, for how long? And I think depending on the success of his tandem with Kristaps Porzingis, as well as this new partnership with Jason Kidd, that's going to really, really dictate the answer to that question. And just to close out, the last thing that I would just like to add, outside of all the Gerson Rosas messy situation and his resignment, firing, whatever you want to call it.
We'll call it firing. I think that got fired.
Yeah, I think that's more appropriate. I share Karl Anthony Towns' Twitter sentiment in WTF, and you kind of heard him echo that again today in his media appearance, where he talked about in his time in Minnesota, he has gone through multiple coaches, front offices, teammates, the loss of a head coach, and obviously, most recently the loss of a parent. So this is a guy who, I really, I feel for Towns. I hope that the T-Wolves can come out and, have a good season, a successful season. A lot of new pieces involved in Minnesota, and that continues to kind of be a revolving door. So that could be we could be on the precipice of, the next superstar forcing their way out situation, even before we've kind of closed the current one, which, depending on where you sit, Damian Lillard, Ben Simmons, quote unquote Bradley Beal, there's a lot of them right now. So a lot of moving pieces here in the NBA, and I'm very, very excited because we get to talk about it all.
Well, we absolutely do. And David, in particular, you are going to be hosting you're going to be hosting some roundtable discussions on this channel going forward, real life NBA focus, breaking down. Really, it's going to be on you. It's going to be a collection of hoopball analysts and you breaking down some of these big stories, and we're incredibly excited to get rolling with that with you. from all of our conversations, you are one of my favorite guys commentating about the NBA. I love the way that you got some unique perspectives, and I love the way that you bring them across too. So we're excited to have you on, bud, and the flair that you're going to bring is going to be great. And I'm looking forward to hopping on a few of those shows myself with you.
I appreciate that, Alan. Yeah, everybody, I'm very, very excited to, begin this journey with all of our viewers and to continue to grow the channel, the show, and the network as a whole. So definitely check us out. We got a lot of awesome contributors. Alan, of course, being one that I'm sure is already a fan favorite, especially with all you beautiful, beautiful listeners and watchers out there. So he's going to continue to be absolutely, you are, absolutely. And Alan will continue to be a part of the show. And I'm very, very thankful for that because, as you all know, he is a very, very talented guy. Takes one to know one, Alan, so I appreciate the shout out. I appreciate everybody who also dropped questions and comments today during our show. Luke and Brad, you guys are awesome. And yeah, we're going to keep this rolling. So very, very excited.
Well, y'all, appreciate y'all tuning in. If you have any other questions, we will be rolling throughout the week, and obviously a lot more is going to come out for Media Day coming up. Really just training camp. It's all here. The NBA season is here, everyone. Drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. You can follow both David and I on Twitter at the handles that you see on the bottom of the screen. And yeah, we're going to check in with y'all next time. You enjoy the rest of your Monday, and we will check in soon. See you, everyone.
Take it easy.